The town of Crowley was small, dusty, and held to its traditions like a mother clutching her child. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets were like weeds, growing fast and threatening to choke what little peace remained. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt streets, when Dennis Crowell stood in front of the town council, his brow furrowed and his heart racing. Beside him, Eliza stood stiff, her eyes avoiding the judge's gaze, her hands clutched tightly together as if to hold herself steady. The moment was unbearable, cold, judgmental eyes piercing through them both. The council meeting was an open affair. The entire town gathered to witness the spectacle. And what a spectacle it was. Dennis, the respected rancher, and Eliza, a woman who appeared out of nowhere only a few weeks ago, were now being forced to stand before the town like criminals. The question on everyone's lips, were they hiding something? The whispers traveled fast, and rumors had already begun to swirl. Was Eliza married before? Was she running from something? Dennis' jaw tightened as he caught the skeptical glances from his neighbors. Eliza, standing beside him, was not much better. The bruise on her cheek, still faint but undeniable, didn't help matters. It was an accusation in itself, though no one dared to speak it aloud. The moment of silence stretched on forever, suffocating. Then, the town judge, a grizzled man with the patience of a saint but the authority of a lion, cleared his throat. "This here's a formality," he said, but his tone was far from neutral. "We need to make sure everything's proper according to the law. Your marriage license, Crowell." Dennis reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the thin, crinkled paper. It was a legal piece of paper that tied him to Eliza in name only. The marriage had been a rush thing, a simple ceremony with a circuit judge and only a handful of witnesses. They had exchanged their vows like strangers, mechanical and cold, with no intention of anything more than protection. But here, in front of the council, it felt like they were being stripped bare. A marriage on paper only. Everyone knew that kind of thing didn't last. The judge took the license, glanced over it, then set it aside. "You both know why you're here," he said, his eyes lingering on Eliza. "We have questions, Mississippi. We need to know what you're running from." Eliza's face paled, but her lips tightened into a firm line. She knew there was no hiding the truth anymore, not in this town. Dennis stepped in before she could speak, his voice steady, even if his heart pounded against his ribs. "She's not running from anything. We made an arrangement. This marriage is for protection. That's all." A murmur went through the room. The word protection didn't sit well with everyone, but it was enough to make the council pause. The silence that followed was thick with suspicion, but there was nothing they could do. Eliza had been at his ranch for a month now, ever since she'd appeared on his doorstep in the dead of night, soaking wet, bruised, and with nowhere else to go. Dennis had tried to turn her away, tried to maintain his strict, solitary life. But a man like him couldn't ignore someone in need, especially when it was a woman alone, desperate, and vulnerable. 3 months ago, he had found her there, sleeping on a bench outside his small cabin, looking as if she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were ragged, her face drawn with fear. The fear in her eyes was real, not the kind that could be ignored or explained away. Dennis had known something was wrong, but he hadn't asked. He hadn't wanted to know. He just brought her inside, gave her a bed, and tried to forget her existence in his home. But the town wasn't so forgiving. The sight of a woman at a man's ranch without a husband, especially one so clearly in distress, was a scandal in Crowley. The whispers started immediately. Who was she? Where did she come from? Was she married? The answer was yes, though not to Dennis. They both stood to lose everything. His reputation, his contracts, his place in the town. And Eliza? She'd be driven out of town, marked as a woman of ill repute. So, in a moment of desperation, Dennis had offered a solution. A practical one. A marriage, he said simply. A fake one. On paper. Nothing more. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't right, but it was survival. Eliza had been hesitant, her fears and pride battling each other. But when she looked into Dennis's eyes and saw the same desperation that mirrored her own, she had agreed. For protection, that's what they would call it. A temporary arrangement. No strings, no emotion. She would be free to leave whenever she chose. And Dennis? He would save his reputation, his life. The proposal was made, and though neither of them believed it would stay simple, they both clung to the idea of survival. "It's just a fake marriage," Dennis had told her with a stern look. "Nothing to it. You stay out of my way, I stay out of yours. And when the time comes, you're free to go." Eliza had reluctantly nodded, sealing their arrangement. It wasn't a marriage in any sense that mattered, but it was the only way to keep the wolves from the door. As the meeting in the town hall came to a close, the judge finally dismissed them. The council wasn't happy, but they couldn't do anything to change the situation now. The fake marriage was officially recognized, for better or worse. Dennis and Eliza stepped out of the courthouse, the cool Wyoming air hitting them like a slap. They both knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The pretending, the distance they had to maintain, and the inevitable cracks in their agreement. Neither of them truly believed the marriage would stay simple. But as they walked away from the courthouse, the weight of their agreement settled in. They weren't just pretending for the town's sake anymore. They were pretending for themselves. And neither of them was sure how much longer they could keep up the act. The wedding was as simple as it could get in Crowley. No grand ceremony, no celebratory feasts, just a quick exchange of vows under the watchful eyes of a circuit judge, a few indifferent witnesses, and a cheap set of brass rings. The whole thing felt like a business transaction rather than a union of hearts. Dennis stood beside Eliza, both of them stiff and uncomfortable, as they said their vows with mechanical words, barely a flicker of emotion between them. The kiss at the end was brief, a quick peck that barely touched their lips but lingered in their minds. Neither of them spoke of it, but both felt it. Something small, a spark of connection, buried deep under the surface, hidden behind the walls they had built. The days that followed weren't much better. They lived in separate rooms, barely speaking unless absolutely necessary, each one trying to keep the distance between them. Dennis focused on his ranch work, the familiar tasks of feeding cattle and mending fences, while Eliza kept to herself, spending her days cleaning the house and cooking meals. The silence between them was deafening, but it was better than the alternative, having to confront the mess of emotions they were both trying to ignore. Despite the awkwardness, small moments of kindness began to slip through the cracks. Dennis started bringing Eliza her favorite meals, the ones he remembered from when he was a child, and she, in turn, mended a broken chair on the porch that had been bothering him for weeks. At night, they shared the quiet comfort of a cup of coffee, sitting across from each other with nothing but the crackling of the fire to fill the space. It was in these small moments that the true foundation of their fake marriage began to form. One built on necessity, but also, perhaps, something more. The town barn dance was the first real test. It was a social event, one where the whole town gathered to drink, dance, and gossip. Dennis and Eliza had no choice but to attend together. They arrived early as a couple, and immediately the stares began. The other townspeople didn't know what to make of them. Dennis, the respected rancher, and Eliza, the mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere. They were forced to put on a show, to act like the couple they were pretending to be. As the night wore on, the music grew louder, the laughter more carefree, but Dennis couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. He found himself watching Eliza more than he should. She moved with a grace he hadn't noticed before, her laughter infectious as she spoke with the other women. When the music slowed and they found themselves on the dance floor, he couldn't help but pull her a little closer than necessary. The touch of her hand against his was electric, and as they swayed to the rhythm, he felt the weight of something he didn't understand. There was jealousy, a strange feeling in his gut when he saw the other man approach her, but he didn't know why. Eliza, for her part, seemed as uncomfortable as he felt. But there was something else there too, a spark of awareness in her eyes whenever their hands brushed. The night ended with more questions than answers, and as they returned to the ranch, the silence between them felt heavier than before. The pretending was getting harder. The next few weeks passed in a blur of mundane routines. Dennis and Eliza continued their separate lives, each staying busy with their own tasks. But there was no denying that something had shifted. They were both acutely aware of each other now, even when they weren't speaking. At night, as Dennis lay in bed, he could hear the soft rustle of Eliza's movements in the next room, the quiet creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. It was a reminder that she was there, in his house, in his life, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't get rid of the growing awareness of her presence. Eliza, too, lay awake at night, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't know how to sort. She had agreed to the marriage for survival, to escape the dangers of her past, but somewhere along the way, things had become complicated. She found herself wondering what Dennis thought of her, how he saw her when he looked at her, if he saw her as a person or just a means to an end. But she couldn't let herself dwell on it. They were supposed to be pretending, and pretending was all they could do. The real world was dangerous, and they needed to stay safe. But despite all their best efforts to keep things distant, the connection between them grew. It wasn't anything they could put into words, but it was there, an unspoken bond, fragile and new, but real. One night, as Dennis sat on the porch, staring out at the setting sun, Eliza joined him, her presence a quiet weight beside him. She said nothing, just sat there, her gaze following his. For a long time, neither of them spoke. And yet, in that silence, something passed between them, something that neither could name. The pretending was getting harder. They had both agreed to it, to a marriage of convenience, a partnership that would protect them both from the world outside. But as the days stretched on, neither of them could ignore the way they were starting to feel. The quiet moments, the small acts of kindness, the growing awareness of each other. It was all too much to ignore. And just when they thought they could settle into their routine, just when they thought they had figured it out, a shadow appeared on the horizon, an unknown rider approaching in the darkness. The figure on horseback was like a warning, a sign that something from Eliza's past was coming to find her. And with it, their fragile arrangement was about to face its first real test. The rider appeared without warning, emerging from the twilight like a ghost on horseback. Dennis was the first to spot him, a figure cloaked in shadows, riding through the dust towards the ranch. The moment the man came into view, a cold chill ran down Dennis's spine. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about the stranger's approach that felt ominous, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Eliza, who had been inside the cabin, joined Dennis on the porch just as the rider slowed his horse and came to a stop. She tensed the moment she saw him, her body going rigid, her eyes wide with fear. Dennis noticed it immediately, the subtle shift in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink away from a man. Something was wrong. "Who is he?" Dennis asked, though he already had a sinking feeling in his gut. Eliza didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step back, as if trying to distance herself from the figure on horseback. "He's nobody," she said, her voice tight, strained. But Dennis didn't buy it. The man was looking right at them, his gaze steady, unblinking. "Eliza," Dennis said, his voice low and firm. "Who is he?" There was a long silence between them, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass. Eliza finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He's looking for me, and he's not alone." Dennis turned to her sharply, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who is he?" She hesitated, the words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, she let out a long breath and said, "It's Marcus, my husband." The words hit Dennis like a punch to the gut. He had known there was something dark in Eliza's past, something she wasn't ready to share, but he hadn't expected this. "Your husband?" he repeated, the disbelief clear in his voice. But I thought, Eliza's eyes flicked to the ground, avoiding his gaze. I thought he was dead too, she said quietly. He disappeared 8 months ago. I thought he was gone for good. Dennis looked at her in disbelief. And now he's come looking for you. She nodded, her eyes dark with fear. I should have left when he left, but I didn't. I couldn't. I thought I was free. There was a moment of silence between them as Dennis processed what she had just said. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. But the reality was clear now. Eliza's past had followed her here, and it was threatening to tear apart the fragile peace they had built. Dennis stepped forward, his jaw clenched in determination. He won't get you, he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. Not while I'm here. Eliza shook her head. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. Marcus is dangerous. He's got connections. People will do whatever he says. I can't risk bringing that trouble here. It's better if I go. Dennis grabbed her arm gently, but firmly, stopping her. You're not going anywhere. Not without me. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. You don't understand, Dennis. This isn't just some fight. This is my fight. I can't drag you into it. You got a life here, a ranch. You can't risk everything for me. Dennis's grip on her arm tightened. You're my wife now, he said quietly, but with fierce conviction. That makes it my fight too. Eliza pulled away, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. Is that all this is to you? A piece of paper? A legal contract? Dennis's expression softened. He took a step closer to her, his voice low and sincere. No, Eliza, it's not just a piece of paper. I may not have planned this, but I'm not going to stand by and let you face this alone. For a moment, Eliza stood there, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was torn between the life she had known, the life she had fought so hard to escape, and the man who had given her a semblance of safety, of something real. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him, but the fear that had controlled her for so long was hard to shake. I can't, she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't bring this to you. It'll destroy everything. Dennis reached out, placing a hand gently on her cheek. It's already here, Eliza, and we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore. The words hung between them, like a promise, a silent vow to face the storm that was coming. But even as he spoke, the sound of hooves in the distance reached their ears. More riders, more trouble. Eliza's past was catching up with them, and they had no choice but to confront it head on. As they turned toward the sound of approaching riders, Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She had never wanted to drag Dennis into this mess, but now, as they stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next, she realized that the man beside her was no longer just a stranger on paper. He was her partner, her protector, and in that moment, she couldn't imagine facing the future without him. But before they could even prepare for what was to come, there was a sudden knock at the door. The kind of knock that made Eliza's blood run cold. She froze, her face drained of color. Dennis stepped forward, his body tense, ready to protect her from whatever or whoever was on the other side. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was a stranger, a man whose face she knew all too well. The knock on the door shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the ranch, a sharp sound that echoed in the silence of the evening. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she froze, her eyes wide with panic. Dennis, already tense from the mounting tension of the past few days, stepped in front of her without thinking, a protective instinct taking over. His hand hovered over the gun belt at his side, ready to face whatever threat had arrived. But when he opened the door, the sight that met him was far from what he expected. Standing on the threshold was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He looked like any other cowboy who had spent too many days riding the trails, but Dennis knew better. The man's eyes, cold and calculating, held the kind of intensity that made the hairs on the back of Dennis's neck stand up. Eliza stood behind him, her breath shallow, and Dennis could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. The stranger didn't speak at first, just stood there, taking in the sight of them both, his gaze lingering on Eliza. Dennis's hand rested on the doorframe, his stance protective, but he knew he had to remain calm. "What do you want?" Dennis asked, his voice steady despite the unease churning in his stomach. The man took a step forward, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice low and rough. "A woman. Goes by the name of Eliza. You wouldn't happen to know where she is, would you?" Dennis's jaw clenched, his gaze flicking over his shoulder at Eliza, who now stood a few feet away, her eyes wide and apprehensive. This man, whoever he was, had come for her. "She's not going anywhere," Dennis replied firmly, his voice holding an edge of warning. The stranger's lips curled into a thin smile. "I think you misunderstand," he said, the smile never reaching his eyes. "She's coming with me. That's not up to you." Dennis's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. "I said, she's not going anywhere. You can turn around and leave, or we can settle this the hard way." The man's eyes flickered to Dennis's hand, resting on his gun, and then back to Eliza. He sighed, as though mildly irritated by the challenge. "You're not hearing me, friend," he said slowly. "I'm not here to argue. I'm just doing a job. You're in my way." The tension in the air thickened, but before anything could escalate further, Eliza stepped forward. Her voice was soft, almost trembling, but it carried the weight of years of fear and regret. "I'm the one he's looking for," she said, her eyes never leaving the stranger's face. Dennis's gaze snapped to her, his eyes full of confusion. "Eliza, no. You don't have to," she shook her head, cutting him off with a small, sad smile. "It's not what you think. He's not here to kill me, Dennis. Not yet." The man smirked, his gaze flicking to Dennis before returning to Eliza. "Your husband, Marcus, has put a price on your head," he said. "I've been paid to bring you back to him. And trust me, if I don't, it'll be worse for you." The word husband hit Dennis like a slap. Marcus, the man who had been Eliza's tormentor, her abuser, and the source of all the pain she had tried to escape. Dennis's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "I thought you said he was dead," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "He might as well have been," Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. "But he's alive, and he's been sending people after me for months. You want me back, Dennis? And I can't go back to him. Not ever." The reality of her situation sank in like a weight on his chest. Dennis looked at the man in the doorway, the threat clear in his eyes. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said again, his voice sharp, more certain this time. The stranger just shrugged, as if dismissing Dennis's threat. "You don't get it, do you?" he said with a grin. "You think you can protect her? You can't. Marcus will come for her himself, and when he does, you won't be able to stop him." Dennis's hand tightened around the doorframe, his mind spinning. He knew this man wasn't bluffing. Marcus was dangerous, and he had connections. But Dennis wasn't about to let him win. "I'll fight him," Dennis said, his voice low and steady. "I don't care what it takes. She's staying here." The stranger's smile faltered for just a second. Then he stepped back, as if to leave, but his parting words hung in the air. "You're a fool if you think you can fight him. I'll give you one piece of advice, Crowell. If you want to keep her alive, you better be ready for what's coming. Marcus won't stop until he has her back, and when he comes, he'll bring the whole town with him." With that, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as silently as he had arrived. Eliza stood frozen in place, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Dennis closed the door slowly, locking it behind him, before turning to face her. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something deeper, a well of pain and regret that she had been carrying for so long. "We'll face him together," Dennis said firmly, stepping closer to her. "You're not alone in this. Eliza didn't answer right away, her eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out whether or not she could trust him. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what you're getting into, Dennis." Dennis reached for her hand, his grip steady and reassuring. "I don't care. You're my wife, and I'm not going to let him hurt you." The words hung in the air, full of meaning, full of a promise that neither of them could deny. The storm was coming, but they would face it together. The next morning came too quickly, and the weight of what was to come hung heavily over Dennis and Eliza. The quiet of the ranch felt like a lie now, like a temporary peace that would soon be shattered. The distant sound of a stagecoach in the distance sent Eliza's heart into overdrive. She hadn't realized how much she'd feared this moment, how deeply the threat of Marcus's return had sunk into her soul until now. Dennis had made his promise, but the reality of facing Marcus and his hired men was starting to settle in. She could feel in the air, thick with tension, every movement more purposeful, more calculated. They both knew that the showdown would happen today. It wasn't a question of if, but when. By midday, the town square was full of people, a buzz of activity that seemed almost out of place given the dark undertones that swirled around the ranch and its inhabitants. The stagecoach rolled into the square, the dust swirling up around its wheels as it came to a stop with a loud creak. Eliza's stomach twisted in knots as she saw the familiar figure stepping out from the coach. Marcus. He looked as polished and calm as ever, his dark coat sharp against the sun, a cold smile playing at the corners of his lips. Behind him, a lawyer, tall and thin with an air of superiority, stepped down from the coach, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to be filled with too many problems. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she stood beside Dennis, watching the scene unfold. Marcus's eyes swept over the crowd, and when they landed on her, they were filled with nothing but cold calculation. It didn't matter how much time had passed, how many months had gone by without a word from him. His eyes still held the same dangerous power, the same ownership that made her feel like a possession rather than a person. Dennis stepped forward, standing tall next to her, his protective presence unwavering. "You're not welcome here, Marcus," he said, his voice strong, his stance unyielding. Marcus smirked, as if this whole situation was beneath him. "I think you misunderstand, Crowell," he replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've come to reclaim what's mine. Eliza is my wife, and no amount of paper you sign changes that." Eliza flinched at the sound of those words, but Dennis didn't flinch. He met Marcus's gaze with a firm resolve. "She's not yours." "Not anymore," Dennis said, his words final, cutting through the air like a knife. "You abandoned her. You left her for dead. You don't get to walk in here and claim her now." Marcus's smile faltered for just a second, the only hint that something was off, before it returned in full force. "Oh, I think I do. You see, legally, Eliza is still my wife. That marriage of yours." He gestured toward the contract in the lawyer's hands. "It doesn't mean a thing. We were married before you even laid eyes on her. I have the documents to prove it." The lawyer stepped forward, his face impassive, and handed the papers to the counsel. Dennis felt his stomach drop as the council members began to murmur among themselves. Eliza's heart raced. Marcus was playing the game well. His words were sharp, calculated. It was clear he had done his homework, and the legal battle was already beginning to take shape in his favor. The council members shuffled through the documents, looking at each other with uncertainty. Eliza's worst fears were materializing, and the doubt in her chest grew. "Eliza," Marcus called, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You don't belong here with this man. You belong with me. Come back with me, and I'll take care of everything. We can forget this whole mess and start fresh." Eliza felt her knees weaken as his words echoed in her mind. She could almost hear the lies behind his voice, the manipulation that had made her believe she had nowhere else to go but to him. She could feel the weight of the years of pain, the abuse, the fear that had been embedded into her soul. She had once been terrified of him, afraid of the power he held over her. But not anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not with Dennis standing beside her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. She turned to Dennis, his steady gaze meeting hers. "I'm not going back with him," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Dennis placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her the strength she needed. "You don't have to," he said firmly. "We're in this together, Eliza. We'll fight this." The town council seemed to pause, waiting for the next move. It was clear they didn't want to make a decision without being sure. But the tension between Marcus and Dennis was palpable. Marcus was used to getting his way, but there was something different about this confrontation. Dennis wasn't going to back down, and Eliza wasn't going to run. The lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We'll need to settle this in court. The marriage certificate you've produced is valid, but there's a complication," he said, flipping through his papers. Marcus was married to another woman before Eliza. A bigamous marriage. That means his claim is not legally binding. The room froze. The news hit like a thunderclap. Marcus's smug expression turned to one of rage as the implications set in. Eliza could see his control slipping. It gave her a sense of power she hadn't had in years. You're lying," Marcus shouted, stepping toward the lawyer. "I'm not some criminal. This is all lies." The lawyer stood firm, his face unreadable. "It's not a lie, Mr. Jacobs. You've been caught in your own web. Your previous marriage invalidates your claim over Eliza. The law stands with her and her new husband." Marcus's face twisted in fury, but there was nothing he could do. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. The town council's decision was swift. Dennis and Eliza's marriage stood. Marcus was ordered to leave town, his claim dismissed. But as he turned to leave, his final words cut through the air like a warning. "This isn't over. I'll make sure you regret this, Eliza." The crowd dispersed, the tension slowly dissipating. But Eliza felt a heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't over, but for now she was safe. And that was enough. The morning after the showdown with Marcus felt like both a victory and a beginning of something they hadn't quite understood. Dennis and Eliza stood side by side in the quiet of the ranch, the weight of what had transpired still settling around them. The town may have accepted their marriage on paper, but now, with Marcus gone, they were left to face the truth. What had started as a desperate arrangement was slowly becoming something more, something neither of them had bargained for. As they worked together, tending to the animals and fixing up the barn, there was a shift between them. The tension that had been present from the very start, the awkward distance they had both kept, had started to fade. There were no more walls between them, no more pretending. It wasn't just about survival anymore. The small moments they shared, Eliza tending to his clothes, Dennis fixing her broken fence, the quiet conversations over dinner, spoke volumes more than they could have said aloud. Yet, still, there was an unspoken fear between them, a fear that what had begun as a fake marriage would end with one of them running from the other. One night, as they sat at the dinner table, the weight of the silence between them was unbearable. Dennis could feel her presence beside him, the warmth of her body against the cool air of the evening, but there was a hesitation in her eyes that made his chest tighten. He knew she was scared, scared of what they were becoming, scared of the idea of truly allowing herself to be loved after everything she'd been through. And if he was honest with himself, he was scared too. Scared of how real everything had become. Scared of how deeply he was starting to care for her. "Eliza," Dennis began, his voice low, breaking the silence between them. She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What is it, Dennis?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts, but the truth was there, in his heart, waiting to be spoken. "I can't keep pretending like this doesn't mean something. Like it's just a piece of paper or an arrangement," he said, his voice tight with the weight of his emotions. "You're not just my wife on paper anymore. You're my wife in every way that matters." Eliza's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she was speechless. The fear, the walls she had built around herself, were starting to crack, but she didn't know how to let them fall. She had been burned too many times, her heart shattered too many times to let someone in again. She had promised herself that she would never need anyone, that she could survive on her own. But now, here with Dennis, the idea of being truly loved, of truly belonging to someone, felt like both a dream and a nightmare. Dennis, she started, but her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard, trying to gather her strength. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him how she felt, but the words were stuck in her throat. I don't know if I can, she admitted finally, her voice shaky. I don't know if I can trust anyone again. After everything I've been through, I'm not sure I'm capable of this. Dennis's heart ached for her, for the woman who had been forced to survive on her own for so long, who had fought to protect herself from the pain of love and loss. He reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. You don't have to be perfect, Eliza, he said softly. You don't have to have all the answers. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something real, something good. But what if I'm not enough? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the vulnerability in her words more raw than she had ever been. Dennis squeezed her hand gently. Eliza, you don't have to be anything other than yourself. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for you. And I choose you. Every day, no matter what. The words settled between them, a promise that neither of them could take back. And in that moment, Eliza realized that she had already chosen him, too. It wasn't just a decision she had made in her head. It was something deeper, something in her heart that had been growing ever since the first moment they'd shared the same space. She had never expected to feel like this, to find something real in a marriage that had started as nothing more than a survival tactic. But somehow, despite all the odds, despite the lies and the fears, it had turned into something far more meaningful. I'm scared, Dennis, she whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. I'm scared that if I let myself love you, I'll lose you too. Dennis's expression softened, and he reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands. You won't lose me, Eliza, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we face it side by side. The weight of his words sank deep into her soul, and she realized, in that moment, that she was no longer just a woman running from her past. She was a woman who had found something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to. As Dennis leaned in to kiss her, tender and slow, it felt like the world outside had paused, as if the two of them were the only ones who mattered. The kiss was more than just a gesture. It was a promise, a vow to stay true to each other no matter what the future held. When they pulled away, Dennis smiled softly, his thumb brushing across her cheek. This is real, Eliza, he whispered. You and me. It's real. Eliza nodded, her heart finally feeling whole, as if she had found the missing piece she hadn't even known she was searching for. I choose you too, she said, her voice steady and full of certainty. And with that simple declaration, they sealed their commitment to one another, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Eliza felt ready to face it. Together. 6 months had passed since the battle with Marcus, and in that time, Eliza had begun to bloom in ways she never thought possible. The sun had risen on a new chapter in her life, one that didn't feel like a never-ending struggle for survival, but like a beginning. Her pregnancy was showing now, and though her body had changed, so had her spirit. There was a warmth in her smile that hadn't been there before, a softness in her eyes where she looked at Dennis. Their partnership had grown deeper, stronger, rooted in something that was no longer just about protection or necessity. It was real, and it was theirs. The ranch was thriving under their care, the land responding to the work they put into it, just as their relationship had. They had found a rhythm, a comfortable cadence in their lives together. Dennis had become more than just her protector. He had become her partner in every sense of the word. He worked the land beside her, his hands calloused from years of ranching. But there was a tenderness in the way he treated her, especially now that she was carrying their child. He took care of her in ways that made her heart swell, helping with the chores when she was too tired, making sure she had everything she needed, and always keeping a watchful eye on her, as if she might disappear at any moment. But it wasn't just his protectiveness that made her love him. It was the way he saw her, the way he understood her in ways no one ever had. He knew when she needed space, when she needed comfort, and when she needed to talk. They had their quiet moments, their stolen moments of connection amidst the busyness of their work. It was in those moments that Eliza knew, without a doubt, that she had found something real. She had spent so much of her life trying to protect herself from pain, from disappointment, but with Dennis, she had learned to let go of that fear. The wall she had built around herself had come down piece by piece, and now she found herself embracing the love that had quietly, steadily grown between them. The morning they woke up to the sound of a rider approaching their cabin was like any other. At least that's what Eliza thought. She was sitting at the table, her hands resting on her swollen belly, her mind drifting as she prepared breakfast. Dennis was outside, checking on the cattle, and the morning was peaceful. But then she heard the sound of hooves, one set, then another and another. The unmistakable sound of a group of riders heading their way. Her heart skipped in her chest, and her stomach twisted into knots. Dennis came inside just as the sound grew louder, his expression unreadable. Eliza stood up, her eyes meeting his in silent understanding. They had both lived with the constant threat of Marcus's return, but now it felt different. It felt like it was finally over. This chapter, this part of their life that had been filled with fear and uncertainty, was about to end. The riders approached the cabin, the sound of their hooves now deafening. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it Marcus? Had he come back to claim her once and for all? Dennis stepped forward, his posture protective but calm, his hand resting on the rifle that hung at his side. Eliza could feel the tension in the air as they waited for the riders to arrive. The dust from the trail blew across the land, coating everything in a thin layer of grime. The riders drew closer, and just as they reached the ranch, Eliza could see the figure in the lead, a man in a U.S. Marshal's uniform. Her heart dropped. A marshal? She could feel the weight of Dennis's gaze on her. But before either of them could say anything, the marshal spoke. "Eliza Crowell," he called out, his voice steady and formal. Eliza's throat went dry, and she stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, that's me," she said, her hands shaking as she clutched the edge of the porch. The marshal nodded, his face serious. "You're free, ma'am," he said, his words making her heart stop. "Marcus Jacobs has been arrested. We've got him in custody. He's been charged with bigamy, fraud, and assault. Several women have come forward after hearing your story, and he's facing years in prison. You're safe now." The weight of his words hit Eliza like a wave crashing over her. For so long, she had lived in fear. Fear of Marcus's return, fear that she would never escape him, fear that she would always be haunted by his presence. But now, with the marshal's words ringing in her ears, she realized it was over. The fear that had gripped her for so long was finally slipping away, replaced by a wave of relief that was so strong she could hardly breathe. She turned to Dennis, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. "He's really gone?" she asked, the words coming out in a breathless rush. Dennis's face softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he took her hand in his. "He's gone, Eliza. You're free." We're free. The relief that flooded her heart was overwhelming. She had spent so many years living in fear, afraid that Marcus's shadow would always loom over her. But now, for the first time, she felt truly free. The marshal spoke again, his voice low but kind. "You've got a future ahead of you, Mrs. Crowell," he said, tipping his hat. "And it's a future you can build without looking over your shoulder." The marshal turned to leave, the riders following him, but Eliza couldn't take her eyes off the spot where they had been. She felt like she could finally breathe, like the weight of years of pain and fear had been lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Dennis, her eyes filled with tears that she couldn't hold back any longer. "It's over," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Dennis pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she let the tears fall freely. "It's over," he murmured, his voice full of emotion. "And now, we can start our real life together." And as the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land, Eliza knew that everything was different now. She was no longer a woman haunted by her past. She was a woman with a future, one she would build with Dennis, side by side, a family of their own. The baby they had been waiting for was close, and as Dennis placed his hand on her belly, Eliza felt a wave of peace wash over her. They were ready for whatever came next. Together. The next morning, the town gathered at the church, a service to celebrate their new life. Women came to congratulate Eliza, their smiles warm, their words kind. The town had accepted her, had welcomed her, and she no longer felt like an outsider. She belonged here with Dennis, with their child, with a family they had created out of nothing. As the service ended, Dennis took her hand, his fingers gentle around hers. "Are we ready for what comes next?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Eliza smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, her heart full. "We're ready."